Up until this point, we have hard-coded the Trello API parameters in the presenter. We're going to wrap them in a new data class called Trello State, which we will store later on. We will also add default values, so remember to use your actual keys and token here before testing the plugin. To persist this data, we're going to use a project-level service. The idea here is to allow the users of our plugin to have different Trello settings for different projects. We have to implement persistent state component, which needs to be parameterized with the type of the state class. In our case, Trello State. You can also use the service class as the state class, but I find that using a separate data class makes a bit more sense. There are two methods we need to implement: getState and loadState. But before, we're going to create a new instance of Trello State and store it as a field of our service class. This is the instance that's going to hold the state, so we will return it in the getState method. For the loadState method, we take the state passed into it and assign it to Trello State. To simplify the code whenever we want to get a Trello service instance for a specific project, we create a new method in the companion object, which will take a project and return its Trello service. We now have to mark this class using the service annotation and also specify the storage location using the state annotation. These values are stored in an XML file, so we have to specify the name of the root tag and the file name using storage. If you want to store sensitive data, there is a different API that allows you to securely store it. To do this, you can create a new credential store class. And the first thing you will need to do is create a new credential attribute instance using a service name. You can consider this as the key that you will have to use to store or retrieve the credentials. To store the credentials, we create a new credentials instance and pass the username and password. We can then use password safe to store the credentials using the credential attributes created before. To retrieve the credentials, we use again password safe and pass the attribute credentials. We are happy storing our data in an XML file, so we won't be using the credential store class. Another limitation when storing the state is that we can only persist numbers, booleans, strings, collections, maps, and enums. If you want to persist something different, like a datetime, you will have to create a converter. In the converter, you have to transform your type into a string to store it, and vice versa to retrieve it. You also need to annotate the field with option tag and pass the converter class to it. We're not going to need this, so let's remove it. Let's go back to the presenter where we hard-coded all the different keys. Here, we're going to pass the state in the constructor and use it to get all the data needed. And because we have changed the constructor, we also need to change the Trello injector. We now have to provide the Trello state as part of the injector, and since the state will depend on a project, we need to pass a project instance as well. The Trello state method will take advantage of the getInstance method we created before in our Trello service and will return the state of a given project. Now, we can use the Trello state provided and pass it to our presenter. But for that, we also need to pass a project instance to the presenter provide method. These changes also affect the Trello form. The Trello action presenter method needs a project instance that will be used to fetch the Trello state. The last step is registering the service in the plugin.xml file. Under the IntelliJ extensions block, we declare a new project service and pass our service implementation to it. Now that we have finished, let's run the plugin and make sure everything still works as expected. We launch the Trello action and we can see how all the cards load with no issues.